Today we're going to talk about that's great, but how do I convince my boss? And my name is David Dillon Thomas, and I run a company where I basically go around and get people excited about and give them better tools for more inclusive design. And I did write this book, Design for Cognitive Bias. And part of that book, I really get into this question here. That all sounds great, but how do I convince my boss? I do a lot of conventions. I go to a lot of conventions and see a lot of talks. And at the Q&A for most talks I see is some version or another of this question. And I think it's a perfectly reasonable question. It doesn't matter how cool the session you were just in was, if you can't actually take it back to work or into your life and do something with it, like, what's the point? Now, like I said, there's a chapter in my book that specifically deals with this topic. It's on stakeholder bias. And when I say stakeholder in this context, I really mean anybody who is deciding how you spend your time, right? So it could be a boss, it could be a client, it could be a colleague. And what you may have noticed is that stakeholders and organizations will sometimes make choices that we might find questionable. Like they might, for example, create 2 million fake accounts and then end up costing the company about $3 billion, right? And our reaction might be something like this, right? Um, and so we might be a little baffled, as you see in this GIF here. And something to keep in mind when you see these decisions is that your stakeholder is making about 95% of their decisions below the threshold of conscious thought, right? They're making a lot of these decisions basically without even realizing they've made them. And the reason we know this is that everybody is making about 95% of their decisions below the threshold of conscious thought. And so before we can advocate for change, we really need to have some sense of what is going on in that 95%. What shortcuts are their minds taking? Now, a good place to start here is a story I like to call The Little AI That Could. So a while back, these programmers put together an AI, and its job was to take a look at aerial photographs and then transform them into what are essentially Google Maps, a generated map. And then they were supposed to take a look at that generated map, pretend like they'd never seen the original aerial photograph, and turn that generated map back into an aerial map, right? And it was being judged on how closely that new map matched the original aerial map, right? Now keep that in mind because it's very important. So the AI did a good job. It actually did a great job. It actually did too great of a job. Like if there were streetlights in the original aerial map, those would go away when it created the generated map because generated maps don't have streetlights. But then when it turned that generated map back into an aerial map, the streetlights would magically reappear. So what they found out was that the AI was basically cheating. It took all the data from the aerial map, hid it inside the Google map, then took that data and pulled it back out again so it could create a perfect reconstruction. So in one sense, yeah, it was cheating, but in another sense, it was doing exactly as it was told, right? Because remember, the goal was to make the new map look as close as possible to the original map. It just found a clever way to do it. It basically invented steganography, which is the art of hiding code inside of photographs, to do it. Point is, computers do what you tell them to do. This brings us to the moral hazard of gameplay. The moral hazard of gameplay is a mismatch between what you want, right? A computer that can take a generated map and make a pretty realistic aerial map, and what you incentivize, which is making the new map match the old map as closely as possible, no matter what. Now, a more common example of this can be found in school. The goal of school is to learn, but what we incentivize is getting A's. And the trick is, you can get an A without learning anything, right? You can cheat. You can bribe your teacher. You can go in and hack the computer and change the grades, right? Now, there are other forms of education which align the goal and the incentive a little better. There are some schools where if you want to advance to the next level, you have to be able to teach what you've learned to somebody else. Also, there is project-based learning, right? Where let's say you have to build a car, right? And in order to build the car, you have to learn things like math and engineering and teamwork. And how well the car works is a measure of how much you've learned, right? You're aligning those things. This, by the way, is a story about a West Philadelphia high school that beat MIT in a car building contest. Now, the flip side of this is poor incentivization, right? So we see Wells Fargo, and you have people creating 2 million fake accounts. Why? Because they were trying to hit sales quotas, right? That was the incentive. And this particular example was such a cluster that Harvard actually did a study on it, right? And one of the highlights of the study was that they would reward employees for achieving a metric without regard to the actions they took to achieve that metric, right? My favorite quote comes from one of the participants in the study who said, "People invariably will do what you pay them to do, even when you're saying something different. So it doesn't matter what's up on your wall of values. What are you actually paying people to do?" We can even see this in law enforcement, right? Where police officers are incentivized by how many arrests they make, right? They get a bonus for more arrests. Well, think about the problem there. If the goal of policing is to reduce or even eliminate crime, and crime were to go away, well, arrests would go away, which means your bonus goes away. So you're now actually incentivized to make sure crime happens. Practically speaking, what happens is that people get arrested for petty crimes, mostly people of color. So what do you think happens when you get rewarded based on, say, the number of features released in a quarter, right? Well, you get that dreaded siloing we all talk about, right? Because now I am focused on my team and their goals for this quarter, right? And we got to work on quantity, not quality. Do we have time for research? I don't know. We got to get this thing out. Or what do you think happens when you get rewarded based on spending all of your budget, right? This is a very common incentive. If you don't spend all of your budget for this financial quarter or for financial year, you will in fact lose it for the next year. Well, again, more siloing, right? Because now my budget isn't your budget. And in fact, your budget might actually take away from my budget next year. So now we're actually in competition, even though we work for the same company. I used to work for a university, and my job was to procure new equipment, right, for the professors. So at the end of every fiscal year, like clockwork, we would have professors coming in and making requests for projectors and smart boards because the students needed those things. No, because they had to spend all their budget. So what would happen if you got rewarded based on how much you learned? And not just you personally, but the company as a whole. If the company got smarter, right, by the end of the year, and no company wants to be dumber by the end of the year, what would that end up looking like, right? Well, now you'd be encouraged to work across silos because something that silo learns could be something that could help you and vice versa. Or what would happen if you got rewarded based on general health and wellness? And before you say, well, that's a silly goal, right? There's no hard-minded organization that would ever think of making such a silly, intangible goal. Well, nation states. Nation states are actually making this a goal. New Zealand, among others, are looking at happiness and well-being and ways to find some way to measure that in order to improve the well-being of their societies. And the thing is, GDP isn't necessarily all that great a metric for your companies, for your country's health and well-being. The GDP of the United States was pretty great during slavery, so it's not necessarily the best measure of health. And by the way, you can compare, say, New Zealand's response to COVID to other countries who are measuring something different. Now, the biases that govern a project are generally determined at kickoff. Why? Because the biases that inform your goals will govern how risk is viewed for the rest of the project. And kickoff is when you are defining risk. So I don't know how many of you are project managers or have worked with project managers, but a lot of project management work is mitigating risk. So if I say at the beginning of a project, this project is not a success unless we come in on time, okay, great. What do I, the project manager, have to look at every single day? How much time have we spent? How much time do we have left? Oh, do you want to do research? I don't know. Do we have time? Or let's say I say at the beginning of the project, okay, this project is not a success unless we come in under budget. Okay, what do I have to look at now every single day? How much money have we spent? How much do we have left to spend? Hey, can we make this more inclusive? I don't know. Do we have the budget for that? Now, a really good example I found of good metric matching is I used to work with a pharmaceutical company, and we were basically building a website that was going to help healthcare professionals figure out which of the company's products to prescribe, right? And so we decided on day one, we are going to align the goals of this project with the mission of the company. And the mission of the company, thankfully, wasn't just make a lot of money, right? Their mission statement was, we are here to improve health outcomes, right? Great. That's measurable. It's a smart goal. Okay. We put that statement at the beginning of every single deliverable. Here's your research report. Why did we give it to you? To improve health outcomes. Here's your content strategy. Oh, what does it say? To improve health outcomes. Now, this became a really powerful political tool because, as you can imagine, at any large size corporation like this, there were warring factions, right? Branding was angry at legal, legal was angry at branding. Well, branding was angry at legal because legal would make it take forever to make even the slightest change to a website. And so we could go to legal and say, hey, legal, what's your job? And legal could say, well, to keep us from getting sued. And we could say, okay, that's great. But remember when we said that the mission was to improve health outcomes? Now, granted, we can't do that if we're being sued, but we also can't do that if it takes 6 months to make one change to the website. True story. So can you meet us halfway? Similarly, we could go to branding, right? So legal was angry at branding because branding would, I don't know if you've ever seen those pharmaceutical commercials where it's like pictures of people wandering through fields or at a barbecue and it has nothing to do with the actual medicine. Okay, they were doing that at the top of every page, and it would take forever to find things like, oh, I don't know, the dosing information or the insurance information, right? So we could go to branding and say, okay, branding, what's your job? And they said, well, to sell these products. And we could say, okay, fair enough. But remember when we said that the goal was to improve health outcomes? Now, granted, we can't do that if we don't sell the product, so thank you for your service. But we also can't do it if the doctor can't actually find the prescribing information because they're going through the barbecue. So meet us halfway. And having the goal as a way to unify these political factions meant we could literally have marketing and legal at the same physical table with stickies, putting together a web page that improved health outcomes. Another example I like comes from a foundation I used to work for, and one of the founding members' goals was for people to act more thrifty, right? To spend their money more wisely. So one of the ideas that came out of that organization was Thrift Store Runway, and it was basically a Tumblr, a blog, where people would send in photographs of themselves wearing looks they had created at thrift stores for under $50, right? And the winning look for that month would get to go on like a runway at an event. So think about the three problems this solves from a content perspective, right? One, I don't have to create any content. I just have to curate it. Two, people are doing the thing, right? They're going and shopping at a thrift store instead of H&M. Three, if anybody comes asking, hey, I want some metrics, is your company, is your foundation actually doing the work? Thanks for asking. Here is photo after photo after photo of people wearing looks they created in thrift stores, right? It is a self-measuring content strategy. Now, we can see this even in law enforcement. There are a lot of conversations about defund the police. There is a city that basically did it. Camden, New Jersey had a police department that was so corrupt. They were like, okay, we're burning this to the ground and just starting over. They literally fired their entire police department and said, okay, you can get your job back, but here's a new list of requirements. Now, the key is that that new list of requirements came in part from the community. They asked Camden, hey, what do you people who actually live here think that police officers should be good at? Okay, that's going to be part of the requirements. And I highly suggest that you recommend that you go in and Google this. It is a fascinating story. There's a lot of pros and cons. One of the cons actually is that the police officers still live fairly far from where they police, which is a chronic problem. If you're not actually living in the neighborhood you're policing, there are a lot of problems with that. On the flip side, though, people were reporting that crime did actually go way down. And I have people who used to work in that neighborhood who saw a marked difference. So again, even in these kind of extreme cases, making sure that what you're measuring and what you're rewarding is aligned with what you actually want and what the people who are affected want is a powerful, powerful approach. Now, there's a really famous quote here: when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And this is Goodhart's law as described by Marilyn Strather. Well, why? Well, as soon as it becomes a target, I cease to care what you're measuring. I have my own little variation on this law, which is there is an inverse relationship between the value of a metric and how easy it is to measure, right? Because clicks, shares, that's really easy to measure, but does it actually tell me anything about what I'm trying to achieve, right? If I'm trying to get you to, dial a phone number so you can talk to a salesperson, okay, can I correlate that with how many clicks that page got? No, but clicks is really easy to measure. So please, can it be the thing that we measure? Now, a tool I think you'll find really helpful in making sure that your goals and metrics and actions are all aligned is called an objective matrix. And it's basically a spreadsheet, right? And your first column is your goals. What is it you're actually trying to achieve? And let's pretend that we're working on a marketing website. So the goal might be increase revenue. That's a perfectly reasonable metric for a marketing website. Okay, the next column over is your objectives. Okay, well, how are you going to increase revenue? Let's hear some ideas. Drive sales leads. That's one. Increase the efficiency of the sales process. That's another. So great. Strategies, the next column over, it gets a little more specific. Well, how are you going to drive sales leads? Well, let's create some compelling content, or let's make it easier to get in touch. Now, the next column over is tactics, and that's where you get specific. No, really, what do you mean by create compelling content? Give me something I can measure. Okay, create case studies, create a newsletter, do a podcast, right? Or improve the visibility of the call to action, right? Now, the next column over is the metrics. Okay, how am I going to know if any of these tactics are working? Now, I have hidden a very bad metric in here. I don't know how visible this is on your screen, but I'll give you a sec to take a look and see if you can spot the bad metric. Under create case studies, the metric is number of case studies. That is a terrible metric. Why? Well, let's go back to the objective of that tactic. I'm trying to do that so I can drive sales leads. What is the number of case studies telling me about whether or not the sales leads have increased? Because yeah, I could do 10 case studies and have no sales leads, or I could do one case study that drives 10 sales leads, right? The number of case studies isn't telling me about the actual goal, right? Whereas improved visibility of call to action, the number of leads is a success metric. That's a great metric. And you can tell because it has a lot in common with that objective. Another thing that we can look out for, biases that our company might have, is something called hyperbolic discounting. And it's really a fancy way of saying that present Dave is bad at thinking about future Dave, right? So if I see a piece of chocolate cake in front of me, present Dave is going to be like, that's going to be delicious right now, and not think a lot about future Dave's blood sugar. Now, companies do this as well, right? It gets really hard to think further out than a month or 3 months, especially when you're being judged quarterly. So a great tool to use here is something called forecasting, where you say, hey, I know we're about to redo this whole website, but first, let's ask, if this works, how will things be different a year from now, right? Is it going to be easier to do our jobs? Are we going to be getting more sales leads? Like, what's the thing that's going to be different? Why are we doing this? That gives you two things. One, something to shoot for, but two, something to start measuring now and say, okay, well, if we think it's going to be easier to do our jobs, well, how hard is it to do our jobs now? How are we going to measure that so we can tell if there was any difference? The flip version of this is called a pre-mortem. How did we fail? Where you say, okay, it's a year from now, we tried to redo the website and it all went to crap. Why? What went wrong? Right? And then you can start to anticipate some of the roadblocks that you might not be thinking of if you're only thinking a month out, 2 months out. So I wanted to give you that groundwork for the types of atmosphere that you might be dealing with in a short-sighted big company or even smaller companies, so that you'll know kind of like what to apply the next few things I'm going to tell you about too. Now, the first thing actually when you want to think about getting buy-in is a bias that you might have. And that bias is called illusion of transparency. And it's this idea that people can see right through us, right? So if I'm going to give a presentation, right, or if I'm going to give a talk, or if I'm going to present my design work, I'm going to go in there thinking, oh, they can see how nervous I am. They can see my sweat, whatever. As it turns out, people are horrible at that sort of thing. There's an experiment where you put 5 people on stage and you say, okay, 2 of you, I want you to lie. Afterwards, you ask the 2 people who lied, do you think the people could tell that you were lying? And they're like, oh yeah, it was obvious. I was so transparent. If you ask the audience, they have no idea. They're no better at chance at guessing who lied. So one of the nice things about the illusion of transparency is that most biases, if I tell you about them, you're still going to do them. They're just a shortcut. This is the one bias where I've seen evidence of if you know about it, you stop doing it. Again, there's an experiment where you have people go on stage and give a presentation, but you only tell half of them about the bias in detail. And the ones who hear about it in detail, give a better presentation. So literally by being in this presentation, I have inoculated you to the illusion of transparency. So I hope that helps. Another thing I find useful, especially in presenting like design work or improvements you want to suggest, is rather than thinking about it as I'm going to go in this room and they're going to judge me, think of it more like research. I am going there to find out how they react to this thing I'm showing them. I am researching them, right? That kind of takes the pressure off you and actually in a weird way puts it on them. They're the ones who have to perform, right? And you just have to write it down. I've talked to designers, especially designers who were presenting their work for the first time, and they found that it took a lot of the pressure off. One thing that can be very useful is to say, okay, it's one thing for you to think that my idea is a good idea. It's a whole other thing entirely for you to think it was your idea all along, right? So imagine your stakeholder comes to think accessibility was their brainchild. All right, let me give you a non-creepy version of this. So I was working with a company and they had this content behind a paywall that they were convinced had to stay behind the paywall. And nothing from the research, nothing from the analytics suggested that this was true, that it was doing them any good staying behind that paywall. So rather than just tell them over and over again and beat our heads against the wall, we said, okay, look, we're going to do a little brainstorming experiment. And here's the thing we're going to brainstorm. First, we're going to ask you, why are you creating this content in the first place? Give me the top 10 reasons you're making this content. Okay, great. We put that up on a wall. And then we say, okay, we talk to your users. Here are the top 10 reasons they're looking for this kind of content. Put that on a wall. And then we said, okay, here's the brainstorm. How might we use content to make both of these lists happy? Left the room. They do their brainstorming, we come back, and guess what one of their ideas was? Well, we could take some of this content and pull it out from behind the paywall. Well, that is a great idea that you had. I am so glad that you came up with that idea, right? Why? Well, for one thing, it's a little more honest, right? Rather than me coming in and saying, hey, here's the research, here's what you should do about it. I'm coming in and saying, here's the research. What do you think we should do about it, right? They might actually come up with a better idea. Two, if it's my idea and they accept it, they could drop it when the going gets tough because, well, that was Dave's idea. You know how he is. If it's their idea, they will stick with it. One of the best pieces of management consulting advice I ever got was from a guy named Don Bridges. He said, if you ever have to make a business case, find out how upper management is compensated. Why? Because it is so much easier to walk in and say, hey, you know that bonus you've been looking for? You know that performance metric you're having trouble reaching? I figured out how to get it, right? That's better than walking in and saying, hey, boss, I know you have 50 problems. Here's the 51st problem. You haven't dealt with accessibility. It's like, no, let me tell you how accessibility is actually going to get you that thing that you've been looking for all along. Now, you have to be able to make a true case that it can do that. But if you can, that is a much better way to present your case than saying, hey, I know you've got 50 things on your plate. Here's 52 more things to put on your plate. It is important to describe how solving your problem or the problem of your users will solve your stakeholders' problem, right? Because what you really want there is alignment. You want to say, hey, we're not at odds here. We're actually both trying to achieve the same thing. Let me point out this thing we're both trying to achieve. One of the best ways to start any email is, as we both agree. As we both agree, blank is one of the things we're both trying to achieve. I think if we made our product more accessible, we would achieve it. It's that kind of thing. Now, the trick with this approach is you have to really hear your stakeholder, right? Which might be a little galling because their stakeholder might be someone who's really used to getting their way. But if you really understand what they are going for in a this is keeping them up at night kind of way, you can frame it in a way that's really going to get through the noise. So kind of an example here is I was working with a company to create a taxonomy for their intranet. And we kept banging into resistance, right? They didn't want to do this research. They objected to this approach to the taxonomy. Bam, bam, bam. Finally, we figured out we had inherited a war between the tech crew who had to implement that taxonomy and the content crew who had to use it. There was a whole bunch of broken promises that happened long before we ever got there, a whole lot of bad blood. So once we finally figured out, oh, we have been hired to be marriage counselors. We got to do that work first. Things went smoother because instead of going off and doing the taxonomy in a corner and coming back and saying, ta-da, here's your taxonomy, we realized we needed to work in the open, like working sessions with tech present, content present, and us so that everybody could see each other, right? And basically, the first half hour of each of those meetings would be like the airing of grievances. But once we could get past that, we could actually do the work. So understanding that motivation is crucial to actually moving forward. Now, another really critical thing to understand, especially about large companies, is loss aversion. Now, this is the idea that it hurts twice as much to lose something as it feels good to gain something. So it hurts twice as much to lose $10 as it feels good to just find $10 in your couch or something. I like to think of it this way. You've ever seen Hamilton, right? Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, who are kind of the antagonists in that musical, are both orphans. But the key difference is Hamilton comes from nothing, right? He has no money, and his song is My Shot. It's all about ambition, going for it. Aaron Burr's family was very rich. He has a legacy to protect, right? So his song is Wait for It, being cautious. He doesn't want to lose what he has, right? And the bigger the company, the more they have to lose, the more risk averse they are. So here's the funny thing about loss aversion. If your stakeholder is risk averse, show them the downside of not taking the risk, right? Rather than the upside of taking one. So let's say you work at a company and they have been using this legacy software that sucks. Everybody knows it sucks. Management knows it sucks, but we've already spent so much on it. IT has this contract. We're just going to keep going. Now I could walk in and say, hey, boss, I found this new software. It's so much better. And if we get it, we're going to make so much more money. And unicorns are going to walk down the hallway. Strangely, not as effective as me going in and saying, hey, boss, if we don't get rid of this legacy software, here's how many people are going to quit. Here is how long it's going to take to find the replacement. Here's how long it's going to take to train their replacement on this crappy software. Oh, and here's how much productivity is going to go down while all that has happened. By the time you've had that conversation, getting a new software seems like a great idea. I'll give you an example from my own life. I'm basically a homebody. And even before COVID, if you were like, hey, Dave, let's go outside. It's beautiful out. Let's go for a walk. I'd be like, yeah, but blanket and Netflix, I don't know. If you said, hey, Dave, the kitchen's on fire, all of a sudden, I want to hear more about your going outside idea. Even the time of day can make a difference. So there's a thing called decision fatigue. And the idea is that every decision you make actually takes physical energy. So the more decisions you make, the more tired you get, the worse your decisions get. And this has been literally shown in a court of law. So there's a experiment where they follow the judges 2 daily food breaks, right? So basically the judge goes and eats something, then comes back. And they found that the percentage of favorable rulings drops from 65% to nearly zero between like breakfast and lunch. Then they'll go have lunch, come back, and magically be back at 65% again. Okay, that is terrifying because these are people's lives at stake, right? And it's being decided in part based on hanger, but this is real. So if you need your stakeholder to make a decision they might feel is risky, try to do it after they've had a nice meal, or maybe even bring some food to that meeting. Even the day of the week can make a difference. J.G. Sanders at the London School of Economics did some research on what she calls the weekly cycle. And this is a cycle for how we measure risk throughout the week. So we start out on Monday pretty risk tolerant, right? We're willing to take a few risks. As the week goes on, that drops until Thursday. We're at our lowest in terms of being able to tolerate risk. Then it pops back up again on Friday. So again, and by the way, this has been shown across all kinds of decisions, like who to vote for, whether or not to go to the hospital, whether or not to rob a bank, right? All of these showed the same curve. So if you need your stakeholder to make a risky decision, maybe do it on a Monday or a Friday, and after they've had a really nice meal. Another key factor here is something called consistency bias. And it's basically like this. If I went up to you and I said, hey, can I put this giant sign on your lawn? You're probably going to say no. But if I say, hey, can I put this tiny, you're not even going to notice it, this little bitty, you're more likely to say yes. If you say yes, and I come back 2 weeks later and I say, hey, can I put this big giant sign on your lawn? You're more likely to say yes because you're sign people now. We like to make decisions that are consistent with our former decisions, right? So I could, if I want to roll out inclusive design at my company, I could say, okay, we are going to form the inclusive design committee and we are going to meet on Mondays and we are going to overhaul the entire design system from soup to nuts. That is basically a meeting generator. Or I could say, hey, boss, on this next project, Can we do a little meeting? It's called an assumption audit. You basically talk about your biases before you start. It takes like 2 hours. This whole project's like 100 hours. Just 2 hours. More likely to say yes. If you say yes, and then you do that on a few more projects, come back and say, hey, boss, for this next project, can we do like a red team exercise? It takes about a day, but then you bring in this other team to look at your work, make sure it's successful, blah, blah. Okay, more likely to say yes. Why? Because I guess we're inclusive design people now. One common theme that runs through all of this is that people need to be heard. They need to feel heard. Even bosses need dignity, right? I could go on about this, but here is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez giving her take on it, and she has to do this at a much higher level than I ever will.
And all of these things, so part of it is like emotional work, and the second part of it is intention. Like, what are you trying to get out of this conversation? And if you're just trying to argue with someone, it's not going to work. You know, you believe what you believe, they believe what they believe. So I think the thing that we have to do is try to have a good faith interaction of trying to learn more about where the other person comes from. Because often what I find is that when I do win people over, it's almost never in the conversation itself that I've won someone over. It's that I have a conversation with someone, I ask them some critical questions, and I pretty calmly explain to them, well, this is where I'm coming from, and this is why I believe what I believe. Why do you believe what you believe? And you kind of like leave the conversation, but very often that person will sit on what you said. And they will sit on the fact that you respected them and gave them space. And then very often I've had interactions like that, and I'll run into that person again a week later, a month later, etc. And they said, you know what? You said something that I really thought about and I changed my mind. But no one ever changes their mind in the actual acute situation of a conversation. It's like afterwards when it kind of sits with them. But if you rush in, fully armored up, attacking them and making them feel defensive, they will never listen to anything that you have to say. So it's really about learning how we can have a conversation again. And also there's a really important conversation about good faith and bad faith conversations. And when I sense that someone is engaging in me in bad faith, I just don't engage the conversation at all. It's not worth my time or my energy. If someone's trying to put you down or belittle you or approach a conversation as though they are more intelligent than you, because oh no, there's no way that someone can disagree with me and still be smart. There's this there's this very condescending tone that we have in a lot of our conversations. And I think it's important to really approach those kinds of disagreements with a lot of compassion, because when they see that, people really look at not just the logic of your argument, but how you make them feel. As much as people hate to say that and admit it, it's true. Yeah,
So an important point there I want to highlight is safety, right? All of the tactics I'm recommending here are dripping with privilege, right? If you depend on your job for your healthcare, for your visa status, all right, there is a very real calculus around, can I risk trying to advocate for change? And so I want to foreground that is a personal decision that always make sure that you are in a position of relative safety and come to that decision, based on your own judgment of risk before you engage with any of this, right? Because I don't want to presume that you're safe to do whatever in whatever situation you're in. That having been said, if you do have a particular level of privilege, right, or even if you're in a role of leadership, there are things here to learn from around saying, hey, maybe let your people know, just be transparent about what your incentives are, what's keeping you up at night, so you can work together about getting to those goals rather than them having to trick you into revealing what you're shooting for. So the other thing, though, I want to highlight here is the difference between changing minds and changing behavior. A lot of times I get asked, well, how do I let people see what their biases are? And I'm like, I mean, you can do that, but I don't know that it's going to achieve what you want, because even if they see their bias, they might still commit it because, like I said before, that's how most biases work. So you have to understand that changing minds and changing behavior are both really noble goals, but they're different goals. And I'll give you an example. Don't mess with Texas is a phrase that actually originated with an anti-littering campaign. So in the 70s, Texas state highways were crap, and nothing was working. So they rolled out this campaign called Don't Mess with Texas, because they realized that one thing everybody in Texas can agree on, whether they were red state or blue state, whether they were liberal or conservative, Texas is awesome. Do not mess with Texas. So by aligning the act of littering with messing with the great state of Texas, you could get good old boys who are like, hey, did you just mess with the state of Texas? Did you just throw that wrapper out the window? You are messing with Texas, right? And behavior changed, right? 75% improvement in terms of littering. And at no point in that whole campaign did they convince anybody to become an environmentalist, right? Nobody changed their minds about that. They just reframed that behavior. Again, here's someone else. This is Stacey Abrams now dealing with this, again, at a much higher level than I ever will.
And the extent to which we focus so much on making people agree with us, we are going to lose. I don't need you to agree. I just need you to do what I need you to do. And empathy is about finding the human connection that makes you think that's good. A less emotional example is the Tea Party in Georgia. There is environmental legislation that the Chamber of Commerce and the governor and Republicans were trying to move for about 2.5 years. And we blocked it. Democrats blocked it. Not because we suddenly had more numbers, but because I went to talk to members of the Tea Party. I did not try to convince them that climate change was real. They do not believe it. I convinced them property values are real, and that the erosion of the stream buffer would erode the property value of those who own that land. And therefore, they should work with us to stop bills that would allow someone to lose the value of their land. Because for the Tea Party, taxes matter. That's their thing. Therefore, I understood what they believed, and I empathized with what they thought was the most important part of the conversation. And from there, talked about the behavior that would be necessary to achieve our common ends. Never had to have a conversation about climate change. That would have been useless. But talking about property values got me the same vote I would have gotten had I spent 20 hours yelling about why climate change was real and pulled out charts and, propped open their eyes like one of those torture films that made them watch the Al Gore documentary every single day. Like, that wouldn't have changed anything. But this reality of who they are, empathy, because empathy isn't just about people feeling what you feel. It's about them feeling that their feelings matter. That's what empathy is. And too often we hold empathy to be, you have to feel me and feel me for why I want you to feel me. That's not empathy. That's selfishness. Empathy is, I want us to have a common bond, and it can come from a different space, but it's just as legitimate if your reason for feeling comes from a place that's not my own.
So wrapping it up here, in the early 90s, Paul Rand, famous designer, resigns from the Yale faculty. Why? Because Sheila Levrant de Bretteville had just been named director of the graduate studies in graphic design at the Yale School of Art. Well, why does this make him so upset? Well, it's not an aesthetic choice. It's more about design principles. Her design process highlighted political activism and inclusion. His design process really highlighted order and exclusion and sort of, let's say, European sensibilities, right? All of which to say this fight for the soul of design is very old. And I tell you that because of this. If you decide to take the mantle, if you decide you are going to advocate for change where you work or with your clients or just in the world, it is important to know that you are not alone. You are joining a legacy of people who have been doing this since design was even a thing, right? And there are many organizations out there today doing the work, trying to find justice. There are even Slack channels and groups that are trying to do unions that are there to support you and that could use your support. So just remember, as you go out and do this work, you are not alone. Thank you.
David, thank you so much. Wow, what a powerful presentation. That was amazing. There are a ton of Q&A questions here, so we're just going to go ahead and get right on into a few of these questions. First thing, is your book available, Sarah asks, is your book available in a digital format or as an audio book? I frequently use a screen reader or audio combined with reading the words on screen to overcome ADHD issues.
So the answer is yes for the digital. It is, if you go to the A Book Apart website, and I think Amazon too, but definitely A Book Apart, you can find the digital version, which includes the Mobi, EPUB, and PDF formats, I believe are the ones, which should work with most readers, I believe. Funny you mentioned the audiobook. I just finished recording it, so hopefully in the next month or two, the audiobook will also be out.
Awesome. We love to hear that. I'm a big fan of audiobooks, so definitely going to be getting that one. All right, next question. We have Mark who asked if we show management the downsides of not taking the risk, i.e., accessibility lawsuits, loss of customers, and they still choose not to act on it, what else can we do?
There's several things, and obviously your case is going to be very specific, but the types of things I think about at that point are, okay, what are they actually trying to achieve? Because clearly what's keeping them up at night isn't lawsuits. If it were telling them about lawsuits, like, oh, wait, that's the thing I'm sensitive about, right? So what's the thing they're sensitive about? What's the thing where they're like, I don't really care if I get sued. I got this. I don't really care, but there is something they care about, right? There's a reason they get up every morning. There's a reason they're coming to work. There is something they are being judged on, right? No matter how high up the food chain, somebody is being judged on something. Something's keeping them. So I don't know what that is, obviously. Often the hallway gossip is actually really good for this sort of thing because it might actually be a personal thing. It's like, yeah, I don't care if I get sued. Just as long as Bob in accounting gets fired. That's all I care about, right? Like there's petty things that often come into play as well. But what I would say is like, if they aren't responding to this risk or that risk, okay, you haven't found the risk yet that they're worried about. Like that's for whatever reason, that's not the thing they're worried about. Again, that would be my initial thought.
Yeah. Which, and this is kind of in that same vein. Beth asks, what do you do in a situation where a supervisor is approaching you in bad faith and you can't just opt out, right? So it's kind of a different scenario, but
yeah. I mean, the other thing I wanted to mention and highlight that AOC said was like, if you're dealing with someone, and this is like on the far end, who like literally doesn't see your humanity, okay, just we've gone beyond the let's find some cognitive bias way to fight bias with bias. Like, no, this is an issue that goes beyond that into like HR or like even beyond HR because you can't always trust HR. But this is beyond that. So none of those will really apply. If it's purely just bad faith, like they're not being a horrible human being, there's a degree to which, yeah, it's going to be time to find allies. The other thing I don't get into as much here, but I kind of hint at the end, is things like unions, right? It's important to remember we are not individuals, right? Unless you're working at like a startup and there's really only 3 people. Like if there is one more of you or other people sort of at your level who are also dealing with the same shit, right? Are there ways that you can unify? Are there ways that you can reach out to similar people at other organizations, right? So one of the things management wants to do, not to get too conspiratorial, but just facts of life, is to make sure you feel like you are your only resource. If you know that, hey, there's actually 10 of us, and if we all say we don't want to work on this thing, it's not getting done, right? Or if it's like a Google level thing where it's like, if 100 developers say we're not going to do this thing, and this has actually happened. If 100 developers say we're not doing this, okay, Google can't hire 100 developers that quickly, right? So that's kind of the extreme case. But like that is another route to think about is, okay, if I personally can't deal with this person, are there other people who can help me? And not even necessarily I got to go above them, but maybe that's a way. But are there other people, like if we could join together, we might have more leverage.
Yeah. So building those like real human connections, build real relationships, which certainly involve, which at the core, design is empathy, right? That's a powerful tool. Love that. All right. So one other question here. How do you get the metrics to show the loss aversion to strengthen the argument? Asked by Amy, specifically with regard to your example of legacy software versus new software.
Yeah, I mean, I think that usually when it's gotten that bad, because I've been that person multiple times at the same job, right? It's like we'll jump from one bad software to another. Usually those things, the evidence kind of just presents itself, right? Like you can like, it's just a question of keeping track and being like, okay, I know that this thing is always going down. I'm just going to start counting. Like really, that's, you've maybe heard this phrase before. If you write it down, it's science. So just like, yeah, if I remember like I had this one software that just kept breaking down. It just, you would try to upload something and it just wouldn't upload. And in that case, I didn't really need to write it down because the IT department was actually pretty competent and they figured it out. But if they weren't responsive, I could be like, hey, by the way, here are the 50 times in the past 2 weeks this hasn't worked. And I did a little rough math. If our advertisers are expecting this amount of revenue, this is how much that downtime is costing us. So here's a dollar value. And honestly, the math doesn't have to be perfect. Honestly, people, if you put together a halfway decent PowerPoint presentation, people are busy. You show them a number. They do not sit down for the most part and calculate, wait, let me check your math. They're usually like, wait, that's how much? Okay, right? So I'm not even saying you have to go hire an accountant to go through all the books. Like, put together just some rough numbers that are like, okay, because to be honest, you want to validate it yourself and not be like, oh, I feel like this is costing us money. Let me see if I'm right. My experience with trying to put math to some of these things is it doesn't take quite as long as you think it does. And the math doesn't have to really be perfect. It just has to point in a direction to make a convincing argument.
Yeah. Yeah. That is a really good point. Let's see.
Another thing I'll say while you're looking is if you can get recorded testimony of someone being frustrated with your company's software or whatever it is that you want to highlight, that is often even more powerful. Like in that pharmaceutical example I gave, when we played audio of a healthcare professional trying to use a website that had all that barbecue crap on it, that hit. Like we could show all the numbers we wanted to, but when they actually heard someone, just the audio of them struggling with it, they were embarrassed. Right? So that can
Yeah.
be another thing. If you can get like a one human voice, one human story that's told literally by that person, that's another very powerful approach.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, from my experience too, being in software, it's funny how many times we just build things out of the status quo, right? Like we build a page and we have this rotating carousel with stock images. They're totally meaningless. They don't do anything. They add no value to the user, but we still put them in there. And then they take up like what, 75% of the page, right? They take away from the actual user experience. So how would you as a maybe an individual contributor, how would you position that to your boss, or to leadership and just be like, look, there's no value gained here. We are doing things senselessly.
I mean, that is honestly where that whole consistency bias comes in, right? So I talked a little bit about that notion of, okay, if I can do this on a few projects and it becomes kind of the norm, then I can slip in this other thing. So change lives in the little boring documents, right? So you talk about that status quo. That status quo comes from, oh, someone's done this 5, 6 times already. And now, in all likelihood, someone wrote down, this is how we build websites. There's always a carousel. There's always a this. There's always a that. And there's probably some budget sheet that says, oh, we want to build a new website. How much is that going to cost? Well, here's how much. And I open up the template. Get into the template. So I used to work at a digital agency. And before we did a project, we'd pull out the template and be like, okay, we're going to do kickoff. Kickoff usually costs this much. Okay, we're going to do the UX research. It usually costs this much if there's this many subjects, right? And the stuff that's in the template, nobody questions. They just start budgeting. And the budget is everything. If it's not in the budget, it doesn't exist. So if you want change, you need a budget for change. So my trick, because for me, it was getting content strategy a seat at the table. My trick was to eventually get it to the point where, oh, the content modeling, that happens here. Before that, I had to say, oh, we need to do this thing called content modeling. Let me explain its value. But once we had done it, even just a few times, I could make an argument for, oh, okay, let's change the budget template. And then you're in. Because once it's in the budget template, nobody questions it. They just say how much. If it's not in the template, people are like, well, why we got to put it in the template, right? Why we got to pay for this? This already costs too much. Suddenly that question goes away when it's already in the template. So make it your goal to get accessibility into the really boring paperwork, like the budget templates, like the SOW, right? We had an SOW where I used to work that said all of our websites, whether you ask us to or not, are going to be at a WCAG accessibility. I forget what the level was, but it was a level. Right? It's like you may want it to be at a lower level. Doesn't matter. We're delivering it to you at this level. An SOW is a boring document, but guess what? That meant we always were contracted to be this accessible at least. So my advice for what your goal should be is to get into the boring documents. You never have to have that discussion again.
I love that. So make those small changes, meaningful impact. Guys, we're at the end of our session here. This has been such a great session.